I'm Cassandra, and 3 months ago, I woke up in a hospital bed missing a kidney that I'd given to save my sister Emma's life. The doctors told me the surgery was a complete success, that Emma was recovering beautifully, and that I was a hero. What they didn't tell me, what nobody knew yet, was that the medical files scattered across the surgeon's desk contained a devastating truth. Emma had never needed my kidney. Her test results, buried beneath layers of forged documents and falsified lab reports, showed perfectly healthy kidney function. My parents had orchestrated an elaborate medical fraud, and I had been the willing sacrifice. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I remember staring at those papers, my vision still blurry from the anesthesia, thinking this had to be some kind of mistake. But the dates were there, the signatures were real, and the evidence was undeniable. They had convinced an entire medical team, convinced everyone that my sister was dying when she was perfectly fine. The worst part wasn't the physical pain or the betrayal. It was realizing that this was just the latest chapter in a story that had been written long before I ever stepped foot in that operating room. The morning they first told me Emma was sick, I was sitting in the campus library at Northwestern, 3 hours deep into studying for my organic chemistry final. It was November, and Chicago's early winter had already settled into that gray, persistent cold that makes you forget what warmth feels like. My phone buzzed against the wooden table, and I saw my mother's name flash across the screen. Linda Martinez never called during exam week. She knew better. Her voice sounded hollow when I answered, like it was traveling through water. "Cassandra, honey, you need to come home. It's about Emma." The way she said it, with that careful pause before my sister's name, made my stomach drop. I'd heard that tone before, usually right before she delivered news that would rearrange our entire family around Emma's needs. I drove the 4 hours back to Cedar Rapids in a daze, my textbooks still scattered across the passenger seat where I'd thrown them. The house looked the same from the outside, the red brick colonial with the white shutters and the maple tree Dad had planted when Emma turned 16. But inside, everything felt different. The air was thicker, charged with the kind of tension that settles over a family when something fundamental shifts. Emma was lying on the living room couch, looking pale but not dramatically ill. She had always been delicate, the kind of beautiful fragility that made people want to take care of her. Golden hair that caught light like spun silk, green eyes, that seemed to hold secrets, and a smile that could make strangers stop what they were doing just to look at her. At 19, she was 2 years younger than me, but she'd always seemed like the older sister in the ways that mattered. More confident, more certain of her place in the world, more loved. Mom was hovering near the kitchen entrance, ringing, her hands in that way she did when she was building up to something big. Dad, Robert, sat in his recliner with a stack of papers in his lap, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. He looked up when I walked in, and I saw something in his expression that I couldn't quite name. Relief, maybe. Or calculation. "The doctors ran some tests," Mom began, settling into the chair beside Emma's couch. "Her kidney function is declining rapidly. They're talking about dialysis, but at her age, with her overall health." She trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air like smoke. Emma reached out and grabbed my hand. Her fingers were cold, always cold, even in summer. "They said I might need a transplant," she whispered, and her voice cracked just enough to sound genuinely afraid. "But the waiting list is so long, and my type is rare, and they don't know if I have enough time." I sat down on the edge of the coffee table facing her. "What kind of tests did they run? When did this start?" I was already shifting into problem-solving mode, the way I'd been trained to do since childhood whenever Emma needed something. Dad cleared his throat and shuffled through his papers. "Dr. Patterson at Mercy General has been monitoring her for a few months now. Blood work, imaging, the whole 9 yards. He says her numbers have been declining steadily. He handed me a manila folder thick with medical documents. It's all in here if you want to look. I opened the folder and tried to make sense of the lab reports and diagnostic images, but most of the medical terminology was beyond my undergraduate understanding. What I could see were numbers that seemed to be trending downward, timestamps that showed regular testing over the past several months, and Dr. Patterson's signature on multiple recommendation forms. Why didn't anyone tell me she was being tested? I asked, looking between my parents. I could have come home, helped with appointments, been here for support. Mom's smile was tight around the edges. We didn't want to worry you during your important semester. You know how you get when you think someone in the family needs you. You'd have dropped everything and rushed home, probably hurt your grades. She wasn't wrong. I would have dropped everything. I always did. When Emma broke her wrist in 7th grade, I convinced my high school guidance counselor to let me leave early every day for 2 weeks so I could drive her home from school. When she struggled with calculus junior year, I spent my entire winter break tutoring her instead of visiting friends at college. When she wanted to apply to art schools but was afraid of the portfolio requirements, I spent 3 months helping her photograph and organize her work, driving her to campus visits, proofreading her application essays until they sparkled. It wasn't that my parents asked me to do these things. It was just understood that when Emma needed something, I would provide it. She was the creative one, the one with dreams that seemed both fragile and vital. I was the practical one, the one who could figure out solutions and make things happen. It felt natural, most of the time. It felt like love. The thing is, Dad continued, glancing at Mom before looking back at me, Dr. Patterson thinks you might be a match. Same blood, type, similar build, and obviously the genetic compatibility is more likely with siblings. I felt something cold settle in my chest. You want me to get tested? We want you to consider it, Mom said quickly. Just the testing, to see if it's even possible. No pressure beyond that. But I could see the pressure in the way they were, both looking at me, in the careful way they'd arranged this conversation, in the fact that Emma was lying right there listening to every word. The pressure was in the air we were breathing, invisible but insistent. Emma squeezed my hand tighter. I know it's a huge thing to ask, she said, and her eyes filled with tears that caught the lamplight. I know it's not fair, but Cass, I'm scared, really scared, and you're the only person who might be able to help. I looked at her lying there, small and frightened and beautiful, and I felt the familiar pull of responsibility settling over my shoulders, like a coat I'd worn so many times it fit perfectly. This was my sister. This was Emma, who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, who taught me how to braid friendship bracelets, who once spent her entire allowance buying me a get-well-soon card when I had the flu. Of course I'll get tested, I said, and the relief that washed over my parents' faces was immediate and profound. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. When do we start? The testing process began the following week. I drove back and forth between Chicago and Cedar Rapids, missing review sessions and study groups, rearranging my entire schedule around medical appointments. The initial blood work confirmed what Dr. Patterson had suspected. I was a nearly perfect match. My tissue compatibility markers aligned with Emma's better than he'd seen in most sibling pairs. This is remarkable, he told us during a consultation, in his office overlooking the hospital parking lot. Dr. Patterson was a tall, serious man with graying hair and the kind of steady bedside manner that inspired confidence. The genetic markers suggest this transplant would have an excellent chance of long-term success. Mom cried when he said it. Dad shook my hand like I'd just agreed to join the family business. Emma hugged me so tight I could feel her ribs against my chest, and she whispered thank you over and over until the words lost their meaning. But something felt off about the whole process, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly what. Maybe it was the way the medical staff seemed overly accommodating, too eager to rush through certain steps. Maybe it was how Dr. Patterson always had Emma's files ready, but seemed to fumble when I asked specific questions about her condition. Maybe it was the way my parents kept steering conversations away from the technical details and toward the emotional urgency. During one of my visits home, I found Emma in the kitchen making herself a sandwich. She was moving normally, no signs of the fatigue or nausea that I'd expected from someone with failing kidneys. When I mentioned this to Mom, she explained that Emma was having good days and bad days, that kidney disease could be unpredictable in its presentation. Some people don't show symptoms until the very end, she said, loading the dishwasher with more force than necessary. That's what makes it so dangerous. By the time you feel sick, it might be too late. I accepted this explanation because I wanted to believe it, because the alternative was too terrible to consider. My family wouldn't lie to me about something this serious. They wouldn't put me through major surgery for anything less than Emma's life. The surgery was scheduled for December 15th, right after my fall semester ended. I spent those last few weeks of classes feeling split between two worlds. During the day, I attended lectures and completed assignments, trying to maintain some sense of normalcy. But at night, I researched kidney donation, read medical journals, watched surgical videos until I could recite the procedure in my sleep. The more I learned, the more questions I had. Kidney disease in young, otherwise healthy adults was relatively rare. The symptoms Emma was supposedly experiencing didn't quite align with the timeline we'd been given. The urgency felt manufactured, pushed along by external pressure rather than medical necessity. But every time doubt crept in, I would get a text from Emma. A photo of her looking tired with the caption, "Rough day," or a voice message where her voice sounded weak and scared. My parents would call with updates from her latest appointment, always urgent, always emphasizing how quickly her condition was deteriorating. "Dr. Patterson says we need to move fast," Dad told me during one of these calls. "Her numbers from this week are worse than last week. Every day we wait is a day we can't get back." So I pushed down my questions and focused on preparation. I arranged to take the spring semester off, knowing I'd need time to recover. I talked to my professors about makeup exams and incomplete grades. I researched post-surgical care and made lists of things I'd need at home during my recovery. The night before the surgery, my whole family gathered at the hospital. Emma and I were both admitted for pre-surgical preparation, and our rooms were right next to each other. Mom had brought homemade cookies, and Dad had downloaded movies onto his tablet, trying to make the evening feel like a celebration rather than a medical procedure. "I want you to know," Emma said when we were alone in my room, "that I'll spend the rest of my life making this up to you. I know what you're giving me, and I won't forget it." She was sitting in the visitor's chair beside my bed, wearing the hospital gown that made her look even smaller than usual. Her hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and without makeup, she looked young and vulnerable and genuinely grateful. "You don't need to make anything up to me," I told her. "This is what sisters do." But even as I said it, I wondered if that was true. Would Emma do this for me? Would she put her life on hold, undergo major surgery, risk complications and permanent changes to her body? I wanted to believe she would, but something deep in my chest suggested otherwise. The surgery itself was a blur of pre-dawn preparation, anesthesia, and then waking up in a recovery room with a bandage across my abdomen and pain that felt like someone had rearranged my insides with gardening tools. The nurses told me everything had gone perfectly, that Emma was already showing signs of improved kidney function, that I was recovering better than expected. For the first day, I was too drugged and exhausted to think clearly. I drifted in and out of sleep, accepting congratulations from nurses and brief visits from my parents. Emma was still in intensive care, they said, but doing wonderfully. The transplant was already showing signs of success. It wasn't until the second day, when the pain medication was reduced and my mind started clearing, that I noticed the papers. Dr. Patterson had left a stack of files on the rolling table beside my bed, probably intending to review them with me later. But I was awake and bored and curious, so I pulled them closer and started reading. Most of it was standard post-surgical information, medication schedules, follow-up appointment dates. But buried in the middle of the stack was a lab report dated 3 days before our surgery. Emma's name was at the top, along with her patient ID number and date of birth. The results showed kidney function that was not just normal, but excellent. Creatinine levels, blood urea nitrogen, glomerular filtration rate, every marker that Dr. Patterson had told us was declining was actually well within healthy ranges. I stared at the paper for a long time, thinking there had to be some mistake. Maybe this was from months ago, before her condition worsened. Maybe it was a different Emma Martinez, though the patient ID number matched the one I'd seen on all her other files. I kept digging through the papers, looking for an explanation. What I found instead were more lab reports, all recent, all showing perfect kidney function. There were also notes in Dr. Patterson's handwriting that I couldn't fully decipher, but I caught fragments. Family insistence. Continue with scheduled procedure. Patient consent confirmed. My hands were shaking as I reached for the call button, but before I could press it, Dr. Patterson walked into my room. He took one look at the papers scattered across my bed, and his expression went very still. "Cassandra," he said, closing the door behind him. "How are you feeling today?" "I'm feeling confused," I said, holding up the lab report, "because this says Emma's kidney function is normal. Perfect, actually." He sat down in the chair beside my bed, suddenly looking older than he had during all our previous meetings. "You weren't supposed to see that." "But I did see it. So can you explain it to me?" Dr. Patterson was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he finally looked up, his expression was resigned. "Your parents were very insistent about this surgery. They had documentation, second opinions, a compelling case for why it was medically necessary." "What kind of documentation?" "Lab reports showing declining kidney function over several months, diagnostic images suggesting structural problems, a history of symptoms consistent with progressive kidney disease." I felt something cold spreading through my chest. "And these reports, were they real?" Another pause. They appeared to be real. The signatures looked authentic, the timestamps were consistent, the patient information was accurate. It wasn't until yesterday, when I was reviewing Emma's pre-surgical blood work, that I noticed discrepancies. What kind of discrepancies? The lab values didn't match what we should have seen based on her supposed condition, so I called the lab directly, asked them to pull their records for Emma Martinez over the past 6 months. He rubbed his face with both hands. "Cassandra, those declining lab reports your parents showed me don't exist in the official medical system. Someone created very convincing forgeries." The room felt like it was tilting. "Are you telling me that Emma was never sick?" "I'm telling you that based on every legitimate test we've run, your sister has perfectly healthy kidneys. She never needed a transplant." I couldn't breathe. The pain in my abdomen suddenly felt different, sharper, like my body was rejecting what it had been put through. "Why didn't you stop the surgery when you realized this?" "I only confirmed it yesterday afternoon, after both surgeries were already complete. The pre-surgical blood work was the final piece of evidence I needed, but by then it was too late." Dr. Patterson leaned forward, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "Cassandra, I need you to understand something. This kind of medical fraud is extremely serious. If what I suspect is true, if your parents deliberately falsified medical records to convince you to undergo unnecessary surgery, there will be legal consequences, serious ones." I stared at the ceiling, trying to process what he was telling me. My parents had lied. They had created fake medical records, convinced a doctor to perform unnecessary surgery, and manipulated me into giving up a kidney that... Emma didn't need. But why? What could possibly motivate them to do something so elaborate and cruel? "I need to see Emma," I said. "She's in recovery, but she's awake. Are you sure you're ready for that conversation?" I wasn't sure of anything anymore, but I knew I couldn't lie in this hospital bed with these questions burning through my chest. "I need to talk to her." Dr. Patterson helped me into a wheelchair, and we made our way down the hall to Emma's room. She was sitting up in bed, looking remarkably healthy for someone who had supposedly just received a life-saving kidney transplant. When she saw me, her face lit up with the same grateful smile I'd been seeing for weeks. "Cass, how are you feeling? The nurses said you're recovering beautifully." I wheeled myself close to her bed and looked directly into her eyes. "Emma, I need you to tell me the truth. Are you sick?" Something flickered across her expression, gone so quickly I might have imagined it. "What do you mean?" "You know I'm sick. That's why we're here. Your lab reports from 3 days ago show perfectly normal kidney function." The silence that followed was deafening. Emma's face went through several changes, confusion giving way to understanding, giving way to something that looked like panic. She glanced at Dr. Patterson, who was standing in the doorway, then back at me. "I don't understand," she said, but her voice had lost its conviction. "Emma." I reached out and took her hand, the same way she'd done to me that first day in our living room. "Did you know? Did you know your kidneys were fine?" She started crying then, but they weren't the tears of relief or gratitude I'd expected. They were tears of guilt, of being caught, of a secret finally being exposed. She covered her face with her free hand and sobbed into her palm. "I didn't want to," she whispered through her fingers. "I never wanted it to go this far. But you knew." She nodded without looking at me. "I knew." The betrayal hit me like a physical force, knocking the breath from my lungs. My sister, my baby sister who I'd protected and supported and loved unconditionally, had been part of an elaborate lie that resulted in me losing an organ I didn't need to give. "Why?" I asked, and my voice came out smaller than I intended. Emma finally looked at me, her face streaked with tears and makeup. "Mom and Dad, they said it would bring us closer together. They said you'd always feel connected to me, that you'd never be able to leave the family because part of you would always be inside me." The words hit me like ice water. They wanted to keep me from leaving? "You were talking about graduate school in California, maybe medical school on the East Coast. They were terrified you'd move away and never come back. They said families like ours, we stick together. We take care of each other." I stared at her, trying to process the magnitude of what she was telling me. My parents had orchestrated medical fraud not because Emma was dying, but because they were afraid I might move away for my career. They had convinced me to undergo major surgery, to risk complications and permanent health changes, because they wanted to ensure I'd always feel obligated to stay close to family. And you went along with it. Emma's crying intensified. "I didn't know how serious it was at first. Mom just said we were going to pretend I wasn't feeling well, maybe get some attention, make you feel needed. But then it escalated, and there were doctors involved and surgery scheduled, and I didn't know how to stop it. You could have told me the truth at any point." "I tried. I almost told you so many times, but then Mom would remind me how excited you were to help, how proud. You seemed to be the one who could save me. She said it would destroy you to find out it was all fake, that you'd never forgive any of us." I sat in that wheelchair beside Emma's bed, listening to her explain how my family had manipulated both of us, and I felt something fundamental shift inside me. The unconditional love I'd felt for them, the automatic impulse to put their needs before my own, the sense of obligation that had shaped every major decision in my life. It all cracked open like an eggshell. "Where are Mom and Dad now?" I asked. They went home to get some rest. They'll be back this evening. I looked at Dr. Patterson, who had been listening to this entire conversation with an expression of growing horror. What happens now? Now, he said grimly, we have a very serious problem that extends far beyond medical malpractice. The next 3 days in that hospital were the longest of my life. Dr. Patterson had to report the medical fraud to the hospital administration, which meant lawyers, investigators, and a parade of serious-faced people in suits asking me the same questions over and over. Did I know the medical records were falsified? Had I suspected anything during the evaluation process? Was I coerced in any way to agree to the surgery? I answered honestly, which meant admitting that yes, I'd had doubts. But no, I'd never imagined my own family would orchestrate something this elaborate. The investigators took notes, exchanged glances, and promised to be in touch. Emma was moved to a different floor, officially for monitoring, but really to keep us separated while they sorted out the legal implications. My parents didn't visit again after that first evening. Mom called once, her voice tight with what she probably thought sounded like concern. Sweetheart, we heard there's been some confusion about Emma's test results. We're working with Dr. Patterson to clear everything up. Don't worry about any of it. Just focus on getting better. I hung up on her. It was the first time in my life I'd ever hung up on my mother, and the silence that followed felt both terrifying and liberating. The physical recovery was actually easier than the emotional one. My incision healed cleanly. My remaining kidney adjusted to its increased workload, and within a week I was walking the hospital corridors without assistance. But every step reminded me of what I'd lost. Not just the organ, but the trust, the family dynamic, the version of myself that had existed before I knew the truth. Sarah Jenkins, the hospital social worker, visited me every day. She was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and the sort of practical warmth that made you want to tell her everything. She never pushed, never demanded answers, just sat in the uncomfortable hospital chair and waited for me to be ready to talk. I keep thinking about all the signs I missed, I told her during one of our sessions. The way Emma never seemed as sick as she was supposed to be. The way my parents kept redirecting the conversation whenever I asked technical questions. How Dr. Patterson always seemed to have her files ready, but fumbled when I wanted specifics. Sarah nodded. Medical gaslighting is more common than people realize, especially when families are involved. Your parents created a very convincing narrative, supported it with fabricated evidence, and relied on your natural love for your sister to override your critical thinking. But I'm supposed to be smart. I'm a pre-med student, for God's sake. I should have seen through it. Intelligence doesn't protect you from emotional manipulation, especially when it comes from people you trust completely. Your parents knew exactly which buttons to push, which fears to exploit, which dreams to leverage. She was right, but it didn't make me feel less stupid. I'd spent 21 years learning to read medical journals and analyze data, but I'd never learned to question the people who raised me. The breakthrough came when my cousin Marcus visited. He was my father's nephew, a lawyer in Des Moines who'd driven down when he heard about the surgery. Marcus had always been the family member who asked uncomfortable questions, who didn't automatically accept whatever narrative my parents were spinning. Something about this whole situation has been bothering me, he said, settling into the visitor's chair with a manila folder in his lap. So I did some digging. He opened the folder and pulled out a stack of papers. These are financial records, credit card statements, bank transfers, medical billing. Want to guess what I found? I sat up straighter in the hospital bed. What kind of records? Your parents took out a second mortgage on their house 6 months ago, $60,000, officially for home renovations that never happened. Around the same time, they opened a new bank account and started making cash deposits, small amounts, never enough to trigger reporting requirements. Marcus spread the papers across my bedside table. Then there are the medical bills, payments to several different doctors, none of them covered by insurance because the services were never actually rendered. Payment to a medical records company for document preparation. Payment to something called Heritage Labs for custom report generation. The pieces were starting to come together, forming a picture that was even worse than I'd imagined. They paid people to create fake medical records. That's exactly what they did. And here's the part that really gets me. Marcus pulled out another document, this one with official letterhead. Life insurance policy. On you. Taken out 8 months ago, right around the time Emma's supposed illness started. I stared at the policy summary, seeing my name listed as the insured party and my parents as the beneficiaries. The coverage amount was substantial, enough to pay off their mortgage and leave them comfortable for years. They insured me before convincing me to have major surgery. Surgery that carried real risks, despite being medically unnecessary. Kidney donation has a mortality rate, complications that can arise during or after the procedure. If something had gone wrong. He didn't need to finish the sentence. If I had died during the surgery, my parents would have collected a significant life insurance payout while maintaining the fiction that I'd died trying to save Emma's life. I would have been remembered as a hero instead of a victim. Marcus. This wasn't just medical fraud. They were willing to risk my life for money. He nodded grimly. It gets worse. I found records of gambling debts, credit card debt, a business loan your father personally guaranteed that went into default. They were in serious financial trouble, and this whole scheme was their way out. The room felt like it was spinning. I'd undergone surgery believing I was saving my sister's life, but really I was helping my parents solve their money problems while binding me to the family with an unbreakable biological chain. The kidney inside Emma wasn't just a symbol of sisterly love. It was collateral for their financial security. There's something else, Marcus said, his voice getting quieter. I talked to some people at Emma's art school. She's been telling people there that she has a rare condition that makes her special, that requires constant medical attention. She's been using the sick sister narrative to get extensions on assignments, sympathy from professors, special accommodations she doesn't need. This revelation hit differently than the others. The financial fraud was terrible, but at least it was motivated by desperation. Emma using a fake illness for academic advantage suggested something darker, a willingness to exploit sympathy and manipulate people just because she could. How long has she been doing this? According to her roommate, since she started school 2 years ago. She's been the tragic, beautiful girl with the mysterious illness. People feel sorry for her, want to take care of her, give her special treatment. I thought about all the times Emma had called me from school, seeming stressed or overwhelmed, and how I'd offered to help with everything from research papers to care packages. I thought about the professors I'd contacted on her behalf when she was struggling with deadlines, the friends I'd asked to check on her when she claimed to be having health problems. She's been practicing this con for years. Marcus gathered up the papers and put them back in the folder. Cassie, I know this is overwhelming, but you need to understand something. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision or a family that made one terrible choice out of love. This was a calculated, long-term fraud that involved multiple people and substantial planning. After Marcus left, I sat alone in my hospital room and tried to process the magnitude of what I'd learned. My family hadn't just lied to me. They'd created an entire false reality, complete with forged documents, paid accomplices, and backup plans in case something went wrong. The sister I'd adored, the parents I'd trusted, the family dynamic I'd built my entire identity around had all been carefully constructed illusions. But perhaps the most devastating realization was how perfectly they'd understood me. They knew I would drop everything to help Emma. They knew I would trust medical professionals and official-looking documents. They knew I would put family loyalty above my own skepticism. They had weaponized my love and used it to manipulate me into doing exactly what they wanted. Sarah found me crying that evening, Not the gentle tears of someone processing grief, but the harsh, angry sobs of someone who'd been completely betrayed. "I feel so stupid," I told her through my tears. "How could I not see it? How could I be so blind?" "You weren't blind," she said firmly. "You were trusting people who had spent your entire life earning that trust. They used your history with them, your love for them, your desire to be a good daughter and sister. That's not stupidity. That's normal human emotion being exploited by people who should have protected it. But what kind of family does this? What kind of parents risk their child's life for money? What kind of sister lets her sibling undergo surgery she doesn't need?" Sarah was quiet for a moment. "The kind that sees family members as resources rather than individuals. The kind that believes love means ownership, that obligation is more important than consent. I don't know how to move forward from this. How do you rebuild your life when everything you thought you knew about your family was a lie?" "One day at a time," she said, "and with the understanding that their choices don't define you. Their capacity for deception doesn't make you naive. Their willingness to harm you doesn't make you worthless." The hospital discharged me after 10 days, but I couldn't face going home to Cedar Rapids. Instead, I drove back to Chicago and checked into a hotel near campus. I needed space to think, to plan, to figure out what came next without my family's influence clouding my judgment. My phone rang constantly those first few days. Mom, Dad, Emma, even some of the extended family who'd heard rumors about complications from the surgery. I didn't answer any of them. I wasn't ready to hear their explanations, their justifications, their attempts to minimize what they'd done. The only call I took was from Detective Lisa Chen with the Iowa State Police. The hospital had filed a formal report about the medical fraud and criminal charges were being considered. "Ms. Martinez, I know this is a difficult time, but we need to discuss your willingness to cooperate with our investigation. This kind of fraud involves multiple felonies, and your testimony would be crucial to building a case." I met with Detective Chen the following week in a small conference room at the Chicago Police Department. She was a compact woman with short, black hair and the kind of direct manner that made you want to tell her the truth immediately. "Walk me through the timeline," she said, pulling out a digital recorder. "When did your parents first tell you Emma was sick?" I recounted the entire story, from that first phone call in the library through the surgery and discovery of the fraud. Detective Chen took notes, asked clarifying questions, and showed me copies of the financial records Marcus had uncovered. "Your parents are claiming this was a misunderstanding," she told me. "They say they genuinely believed Emma was sick, that they were acting on medical advice, that any financial irregularities were coincidental. And Emma? Emma is claiming she was manipulated by your parents, that she was afraid to speak up, that she tried to stop the surgery but was pressured to continue." I thought about Emma's confession in the hospital room, how she'd admitted to knowing her kidneys were fine, how she'd explained the family's motivation for keeping me close. "She's lying." "We think so too, but proving it requires demonstrating intent and premeditation. That's where your testimony becomes crucial." Detective Chen explained the potential charges: healthcare fraud, insurance fraud, conspiracy, reckless endangerment. The penalties could include significant prison time and financial restitution. But pursuing charges would mean testifying against my own family, making our private betrayal into public record, ensuring that this story would follow all of us for the rest of our lives. "I need time to think about it," I told her. "Of course, but don't wait too long. Evidence has a way of disappearing when people have time to prepare." I spent the next week walking around Chicago, trying to sort through my feelings. Part of me wanted justice, wanted my family to face consequences for what they'd done. But another part of me just wanted to disappear, to start over somewhere they couldn't find me, to build a new life with people who didn't know anything about kidney donations or medical fraud. The decision became clearer when I received a package at my hotel. No return address, just my name written in Emma's distinctive handwriting. Inside was a flash drive and a handwritten note. Cassie, I know you probably hate me right now, and I understand why. I know saying I'm sorry isn't enough, but I need you to know that I never wanted it to go this far. I've been carrying this guilt for months, and I can't do it anymore. The flash drive has recordings of some conversations with Mom and Dad. I started recording them when I realized how serious this was getting, thinking maybe I could use them to convince them to stop. I never did, but maybe they'll help you understand what really happened. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I hope someday you can find a way to move forward. Love, Emma. I stared at that note for a long time before plugging the flash drive into my laptop. There were 12 audio files, each one labeled with dates spanning the past 6 months. I started with the earliest one. Emma's voice shaky and uncertain. Mom, I don't think I can keep pretending to be sick. Cassie is getting really worried and she's asking questions I don't know how to answer. Mom's voice sharp and impatient. You just need to commit to the role, sweetheart. Cassie wants to help you, wants to feel needed. We're giving her a chance to be a hero. But what if something goes wrong during the surgery? What if she gets hurt? Dr. Patterson is an excellent surgeon. The risks are minimal. The risks wouldn't exist at all if we just told her the truth. Dad's voice joining the conversation. Emma, we've been through this. Your sister is planning to leave Iowa. Probably forever. She's talking about medical school in Boston, research opportunities in California. If she goes, we'll never see her again. So, we're going to tie her to us with surgery? We're going to ensure she understands the importance of family. I listened to file after file, hearing my parents plan my manipulation with the same casual tone they might use to discuss vacation plans. They talked about which doctors to approach, how to create convincing medical records, what symptoms Emma should claim to be experiencing. In one particularly chilling conversation, Dad discussed the life insurance policy. It's just a precaution, he explained to Emma. Kidney donation is generally safe, but there are always risks. If something happens, at least we'd be able to take care of the family financially. You're talking about Cassie dying. I'm talking about being prepared for all possibilities. The final recording was from 3 days before our surgery. Emma's voice was different, more desperate. I can't do this anymore. I'm going to tell Cassie the truth. Mom's response was immediate and vicious. If you tell her now, you'll destroy her. She's so excited to help you, so proud to be your donor. Finding out it was all fake will break her heart. Her heart will heal. Surgery scars don't. Emma, listen to me very carefully. If you sabotage this now, after everything we've invested, after all the planning and preparation, you'll be responsible for destroying this family. Cassie will blame you for the deception. We'll lose the house to foreclosure, and everyone will know what kind of selfish person you really are. And if I don't tell her? Then you save your sister from unnecessary pain, help your family through a difficult financial period, and ensure that we all stay close together like families are supposed to. The recording ended there, but I sat staring at my laptop screen for another hour. Emma had tried to stop it, at least toward the end. She'd been manipulated too, caught in the same web of family loyalty and emotional blackmail that had trapped me. But she'd also participated for months, allowing me to worry about her health, letting me rearrange my life around her supposed needs, accepting my care and concern while knowing it was all based on lies. She'd been both victim and accomplice, and I wasn't sure how to reconcile those two realities. I called Detective Chen the next morning and told her I was ready to cooperate fully with the investigation. The recordings would provide the evidence needed to prove premeditation and intent. My testimony would demonstrate the extent of the emotional manipulation. Together, we could build a case that might prevent my family from doing this to anyone. There's something else you should know, Detective Chen told me during our follow-up meeting. We've been investigating Dr. Patterson's role in all this. It appears he was genuinely deceived by the falsified records, but he also failed to follow proper verification procedures. The medical board is reviewing his license. I felt a complicated mix of emotions about that news. Dr. Patterson had been manipulated too, but his failure to catch the deception had allowed my family to put me at serious risk. Someone needed to be held accountable for the systemic failures that had made this possible. When will charges be filed? Within the next 2 weeks. Your parents and Emma will be arrested simultaneously to prevent them from coordinating their stories or destroying evidence. I thought about my family's house in Cedar Rapids, the red brick colonial where I'd grown up believing I was loved unconditionally. Soon it would be searched by police. My parents would be handcuffed in their own driveway, and neighbors would whisper about the family that had seemed so normal from the outside. Will there be media coverage? Probably. Medical fraud cases involving family members tend to attract attention, especially when they involve unnecessary surgery. I imagined seeing our story on the evening news, reading about it in newspapers, watching it become a cautionary tale about family manipulation and medical ethics. The privacy I'd lost when I woke up missing a kidney would be completely gone once this became public. But publicity also meant accountability. It meant other families would see the consequences of this kind of manipulation. It meant doctors might be more careful about verifying medical records. It meant Emma and my parents would face real consequences for their choices. I'm ready, I told Detective Chen. Let's do this. The arrests happened on a Tuesday morning in March. I was in Chicago, sitting in my constitutional law class, when my phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. It's done. All 3 in custody. I excused myself from class and sat in the hallway, staring at that message. My parents and sister were in jail. The family that had raised me, loved me, and ultimately betrayed me was now facing criminal charges because of my decision to seek justice. I felt relieved and devastated in equal measure. The local news picked up the story within hours. Cedar Rapids family charged in medical fraud scheme. The reporter stood in front of our house, explaining how parents had convinced their daughter to donate a kidney under false pretenses. They used my school photo from high school, Emma's art school headshot, and file footage of the hospital, where the surgery had taken place. My phone started ringing immediately. Reporters, producers, documentary filmmakers, all wanting to hear my side of the story. I didn't answer any of them. I wasn't ready to become a public figure, a symbol of family betrayal, a case study in medical ethics. Instead, I did something I'd never done before in my life. I put my own needs first. I withdrew from spring semester classes, forfeiting my tuition but preserving my sanity. I found a therapist who specialized in family trauma and complex grief. I started seeing her twice a week, slowly learning to separate my identity from my family's expectations. You're grieving the family you thought you had, Dr. Williams explained during one of our sessions. That's a legitimate loss, even though those people are still alive. The parents who loved you unconditionally, the sister who would never hurt you, the family dynamics that felt safe and predictable, all of that is gone. But how do I move forward? How do I trust anyone again when the people who were supposed to protect me were the ones who hurt me most? Trust is rebuilt slowly, with people who earn it through consistent actions over time. It starts with learning to trust yourself, your instincts, your right to prioritize your own well-being. The therapy helped, but the real breakthrough came when I started connecting with other people who'd experienced family betrayal. Online support groups, books written by survivors, podcasts featuring people who'd rebuilt their lives after discovering that their families weren't who they claimed to be. I wasn't alone. Family manipulation, medical gaslighting, financial exploitation by relatives, all of it was more common than I'd realized. There were people who'd been convinced to give up inheritance rights, people who'd undergone unnecessary medical procedures, people who'd been isolated from friends and opportunities to keep them dependent on family approval. Reading their stories, hearing their voices, understanding their recovery processes helped me realize that healing was possible. It wouldn't be quick or easy, but it was achievable. 3 months after the arrests, the plea negotiations began. My parents' lawyer reached out through Detective Chen, proposing a deal that would involve reduced charges in exchange for full restitution and public admission of wrongdoing. They want to avoid trial, Detective Chen explained. The evidence is overwhelming, and a public trial would involve testimony that makes them look even worse than they already do. What kind of restitution? Full payment of your medical expenses, compensation for pain and suffering, reimbursement for lost educational opportunities, and ongoing therapy costs. It was more money than I'd ever seen, enough to finish my education without financial stress, enough to start over wherever I wanted to go. But accepting it would mean agreeing to a plea deal that might result in lighter sentences for my family. What would happen if we went to trial instead? Potentially longer prison sentences, but also public testimony that would be incredibly painful for you. Every detail of the manipulation would become part of the court record, accessible to media and the general public forever. I thought about sitting in a courtroom, describing how my family had manipulated me, answering questions about my medical decisions and emotional vulnerabilities. I thought about reporters analyzing every aspect of our family dynamic, experts debating whether I'd been naive or trusting or stupid. I need to talk to Emma first. Detective Chen arranged for me to visit Emma at the county jail where she was being held pending trial. It was my first time seeing her since the hospital, and I was shocked by how different she looked. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, she wore no makeup, and the orange jumpsuit made her skin look pale and drawn. But what struck me most was her expression. The calculating look I'd glimpsed in the hospital was gone, replaced by something that looked like genuine remorse. "Cassie," she said when I sat down across from her in the visiting room. I wasn't sure you'd come. I wasn't sure either. We sat in silence for a moment, both of us probably thinking about the last time we'd been in the same room, when she'd confessed to knowing about the fraud while lying in a hospital bed with my kidney, inside her. "I've been listening to the recordings," I told her. "The ones you sent me." Emma's eyes filled with tears. "I should have stopped it sooner. I should have told you the truth from the beginning." "Why didn't you?" "Because I was scared. Because I wanted Mom and Dad to be proud of me for once. Because I liked being the center of attention, having people worry about me and take care of me." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "And because I was jealous of you." "Jealous of me?" "You were always the smart one, the responsible one. The one with plans and goals and a future that didn't depend on other people taking care of you. I felt like I was just floating along, not really good at anything except being pretty and sad." I stared at her across the metal table, seeing my sister clearly for perhaps the first time in our lives. Not the fragile beauty who needed constant protection, not the manipulative accomplice who'd helped orchestrate medical fraud, but a young woman who'd been as trapped by our family dynamics as I had been. "Emma, you're talented. Your art is beautiful. You're intelligent. You could build a real life for yourself if you wanted to." "Not anymore. Who's going to trust me after this? Who's going to believe anything I say? I'll always be the girl who tricked her sister into giving her a kidney she didn't need." The pain in her voice was real, and for a moment I felt the old impulse to comfort her, to minimize her suffering, to take responsibility for fixing her problems. But I recognized the feeling and pushed it away. "You'll have to rebuild trust. The same way I will," I told her. "One honest choice at a time." Emma nodded, still crying. "I know I don't have the right to ask this, but is there any chance you could ever forgive me?" I thought about forgiveness, about what it would mean and what it wouldn't mean. Forgiving Emma wouldn't erase what had happened or restore the trust we'd lost. It wouldn't give me back my kidney or undo the trauma of discovering my family's betrayal. But it might free me from carrying the weight of their choices for the rest of my life. I don't know, I told her honestly. Maybe someday. But it would have to be earned, not just requested. I understand. When I left the jail, that day I felt something shift inside me. The conversation with Emma hadn't fixed anything, but it had clarified something important. I could choose how much of my energy to spend on anger, how much of my future to sacrifice to their past mistakes, how much of my identity to build around being their victim. I called Detective Chen that evening and told her I was ready to accept the plea agreement. Not because I thought my family deserved leniency, but because I deserved to move forward with my life instead of spending years reliving their betrayal in courtrooms and depositions. The formal sentencing happened 6 weeks later. I attended, sitting in the back of the courtroom, watching my parents and sister stand before a judge and admit to charges of healthcare fraud, conspiracy, and reckless endangerment. Mom cried throughout the proceedings. Dad stood rigid and silent. Emma read a prepared statement apologizing to me, to the medical professionals they'd deceived, and to the justice system they'd attempted to manipulate. The judge sentenced them each to 2 years in prison, with the possibility of early release for good behavior. They would also pay substantial fines and restitution, and be required to complete community service focused on medical ethics education. It felt both like justice and like an ending to a chapter of my life I was ready to close. After the sentencing, I drove back to Chicago and began planning my future without my family's input for the first time in my life. I would finish my undergraduate degree, apply to medical school, and use my experience to become the kind of doctor who could recognize when families were manipulating the healthcare system. The money from the restitution would pay for my education and give me the freedom to choose schools and opportunities based on my goals rather than financial constraints. I would move somewhere my family couldn't find me easily, build relationships with people who knew me as Cassandra rather than as Emma's sister or Robert and Linda's daughter. Most importantly, I would learn to trust my own instincts, to question authority figures when something felt wrong, to prioritize my own well-being even when it disappointed people I cared about. The physical scar from my surgery would fade over time, but the emotional scars would take longer to heal. That was okay. I was learning that healing wasn't about forgetting what had happened or pretending it hadn't shaped me. It was about choosing how to let it influence the person I became. I was 21 years old, missing a kidney, and estranged from my entire immediate family. By any reasonable measure, my life had been derailed by their betrayal. But for the first time since I could remember, I felt truly free. 2 years passed before I saw any of them again. I'd finished my degree at Northwestern, moved to Portland for a gap year working at a medical research facility, and was preparing to start medical school at OHSU in the fall. The distance had been healing in ways I hadn't expected. Without the constant weight of family obligations and emotional manipulation, I'd discovered parts of myself I'd never known existed. I was more decisive than I'd realized, more independent, more capable of forming healthy relationships. I'd made friends who valued my opinion, dated people who respected my boundaries, and built a life that felt authentically mine for the first time ever. The scar on my abdomen had faded to a thin white line, barely visible unless you knew where to look. The call came on a Tuesday evening in May. I almost didn't answer because I didn't recognize the number, but something made me pick up. "Cassandra? It's Marcus." My cousin's voice sounded strained, older somehow. We'd stayed in touch sporadically since the trial, but our conversations were usually brief updates about legal proceedings or family news I wasn't sure I wanted to hear. "Hey Marcus, how are you? I'm calling because Emma got out last week. Early release for good behavior." I sat down on my couch, suddenly feeling unsteady. I'd known this day would come eventually, but 2 years of freedom had made it feel abstract, theoretical. How is she? Different. Really different. She's been staying with me and Janet while she figures out her next steps. And Cassie, I think you should know that she's been asking about you constantly. What kind of asking? Where you're living, how you're doing, whether you'd be willing to see her. She seems genuinely remorseful, not like the manipulative person we saw during the trial. I walked to my kitchen window and looked out at the Portland skyline, trying to process this information. Part of me had hoped Emma would disappear after prison, start a new life somewhere far away where she couldn't complicate mine. But another part of me, a part I'd been trying to ignore, had wondered what kind of person she'd become after facing real consequences for her actions. What does she want? To apologize, I think. Really apologize, not the performative kind she did in court. She's been in therapy, working through what happened, trying to understand how the family dynamic contributed to everything. Marcus paused, and I could hear voices in the background. She's here now, actually. Do you want to talk to her? No. The word came out faster than I'd intended. Not yet. I'm not ready. I understand. But Cassie, I think you should also know that your parents are getting out next month. This news hit harder than hearing about Emma. My parents had been the architects of the entire scheme, the ones who'd put financial pressure above my safety, who'd been willing to risk my life for their convenience. The idea of them walking, free, possibly trying to contact me, made my chest tighten with anxiety. Have they been asking about me too? Your mother has been writing letters. To Emma, to me, to your Aunt Beverly. She keeps talking about family healing and moving forward together. I closed my eyes, recognizing the language Mom had always used when she wanted to smooth over problems without actually addressing them. Family healing had always meant everyone pretending nothing had happened while returning to the same dysfunctional patterns. I don't want any contact with them, Marcus. None at all. I figured, which is why I'm calling to give you a heads up. I think they're going to try to find you, maybe show up wherever you're living. The thought of my parents appearing at my apartment, my workplace, my medical school, made me feel sick. I'd worked so hard to build a life free from their influence, and the idea of them forcing their way back into it was terrifying. What can I do legally to prevent that? Restraining order would be the most direct approach. Given the circumstances of the case, you'd probably be able to get one approved pretty easily. After I hung up with Marcus, I sat in my living room and tried to figure out how I felt about everything he'd told me. 2 years of therapy had taught me to recognize my emotions instead of immediately trying to fix everyone else's problems. But this situation brought up feelings I wasn't sure how to name. I wasn't angry anymore, not in the sharp, constant way I'd been right after discovering the fraud. That rage had burned out over time, replaced by something more like profound sadness for the family relationships I'd lost, and the trust I'd never be able to recover. But I also felt protective of the peace I'd built. The life I was living now wasn't perfect, but it was mine. I made decisions based on my own values and goals, not on what would make other people happy or comfortable. I'd learned to set boundaries, to say no without feeling guilty, to prioritize my own well-being without constantly justifying those choices. The idea of my family disrupting that progress felt like a threat to everything I'd worked to achieve. I called Dr. Williams, my therapist, and left a voicemail requesting an emergency session. She called back within an hour and agreed to see me the next day. "How do you feel about the possibility of seeing Emma again?" she asked during our session. Confused. Part of me is curious about how she's changed, whether she's genuinely different or just better at seeming remorseful. But I'm also afraid that seeing her will undo some of the progress I've made. What kind of progress are you worried about losing? I thought about the question seriously. I've learned to trust my instincts, to believe that my feelings and needs matter as much as anyone else's. But Emma was always so good at making me feel responsible for her emotions, for fixing her problems. I'm afraid that seeing her will trigger those old patterns. Dr. Williams nodded. Those are valid concerns. But you've also developed tools for recognizing manipulation, for maintaining boundaries, for protecting yourself emotionally. You're not the same person who agreed to donate a kidney without asking enough questions. She was right. The woman I'd become over the past 2 years wouldn't have been vulnerable to the kind of manipulation my family had used. I'd learned to question authority figures, to seek second opinions, to trust my gut when something felt wrong. What about my parents? That seems like a different situation entirely. Emma was young and caught up in a family dynamic she didn't fully understand. Your parents were adults who orchestrated a complex fraud. The power dynamic there is completely different. I don't want to see them. I don't want to hear their explanations or their apologies. I just want them to leave me alone. Then that's what we'll work toward achieving. You have the right to determine who has access to your life, regardless of genetics or history. Over the next few weeks, I took concrete steps to protect myself from unwanted contact. I filed for a restraining order against my parents, which was approved based on the documented history of manipulation and fraud. I changed my phone number and email address, updating only the people I trusted with the new information. I even looked into changing my last name, though I ultimately decided that would be giving them too much power over my identity. But the decision about Emma was more complicated. Marcus called several times with updates about her progress, and despite my reservations, I found myself curious about the person she was becoming. She got a job at a nonprofit that works with families affected by medical fraud, he told me, during one of these calls. It's minimum wage, basic clerical work, but she seems committed to it. Why that organization specifically? And she says she wants to understand the impact of what she did, wants to help other families avoid the kind of situation she helped create. I didn't know what to make of this information. It could be genuine remorse and a desire to make amends, or it could be another manipulation, a way to seem reformed while actually gathering stories she could use to seem more sympathetic. Has she mentioned me specifically in relation to this job? She talks about you constantly, but not in the obsessive way she used to. More like someone who's trying to understand the harm they caused so they can figure out how to live with it. Marcus paused. Cassie, I know this is complicated, and I'm not trying to pressure you into anything, but I think she's genuinely changed. Prison was hard on her, but more than that, I think facing the reality of what she participated in broke something in her that needed to be broken. What do you mean? The entitlement, the assumption that other people existed to take care of her problems, the belief that her feelings mattered more than other people's safety. All of that seems to be gone. I thought about the Emma I'd grown up with, the sister who'd expected me to solve her problems and manage her emotions while never considering the cost to me. If that dynamic had really changed, if she'd developed genuine empathy and accountability, then maybe a conversation would be possible. Would you be willing to meet with her in a controlled setting? Marcus asked. Somewhere public, with me there as a buffer, just to see how it feels? I took a week to think about it, discussing the possibility endlessly with Dr. Williams and my close friends in Portland. The consensus was that I should trust my instincts and be prepared to leave immediately if the interaction felt harmful or manipulative. You don't owe her forgiveness or a relationship, my friend Rachel reminded me, but you also don't have to carry the weight of this estrangement forever if you don't want to. In the end, I agreed to meet Emma for coffee in a public place in Des Moines, with Marcus present. I drove down from Portland, staying in a hotel rather than with family, maintaining my ability to leave whenever I wanted. The coffee shop was busy enough to feel safe but quiet enough for conversation. I arrived early and chose a table near the back where I could see the entrance and exits. When Emma walked in, I barely recognized her. She'd gained weight in a healthy way, filling out the gaunt thinness I remembered from the trial. Her hair was shorter, more practical, and she wore simple jeans and a sweater that looked comfortable rather than carefully chosen for effect. But the biggest difference was in her posture and expression. The calculated charm was gone, replaced by something that looked like genuine nervousness. "Cassandra," she said when she reached my table. "Thank you for agreeing to see me." She didn't try to hug me or touch me, just sat down across from me and folded her hands in her lap. Marcus took the chair between us, clearly prepared to intervene if necessary. "You look good," I said, because it was true and because I didn't know how else to start. "I feel different than I have in years. Clearer, I guess." Emma's voice was quieter than I remembered, less performative. "I know you probably don't want to hear this, but I need to say it anyway. I'm sorry. Not sorry that I got caught or sorry that there were consequences, but sorry that I participated in hurting you." I studied her face, looking for signs of the manipulation I'd learned to recognize, but her expression seemed open, direct, without the calculated vulnerability she'd used so effectively in the past. "What changed?" I asked. "Prison, partly. Being forced to live with the consequences of my choices instead of having other people fix my problems. But mostly therapy, really intensive therapy about family dynamics and manipulation and why I thought I was entitled to other people's sacrifice." Emma looked down at her hands. "I spent my whole life believing that being loved meant being taken care of, that if people really cared about me, they'd solve my problems and manage my emotions. I never learned to consider what that cost other people. And now? Now I'm trying to learn how to take care of myself, how to build relationships based on mutual respect instead of dependency." She looked up at me. "I know I don't have the right to ask for your forgiveness or your friendship. I know what I participated in was unforgivable. But I wanted you to know that I understand the harm I caused, and I'm committed to being a different person." Marcus had been right. Emma seemed fundamentally different. The entitled, manipulative person I remembered had been replaced by someone who appeared to understand accountability and consequences. "What do you want from me?" I asked. "Nothing. Honestly, nothing. I know you've built a good life without us, and I don't want to disrupt that. I just wanted the chance to apologize in person and to let you know that the sister who hurt you doesn't exist anymore." We talked for another hour, carefully, with Marcus facilitating when the conversation got difficult. Emma told me about her work at the nonprofit, about the stories she heard from other families who'd been victimized by medical fraud. She talked about the therapy she was continuing, the steps she was taking to build a life based on honest work and genuine relationships. I told her about medical school, about my research interests, about the ways I was hoping to use my experience to help other patients avoid manipulation. It was strange, talking to her like a normal person, rather than someone I needed to protect myself from. When we said goodbye, Emma stood up first. "I know this might be the only time we ever talk, and that's okay. But if you ever want to try building some kind of relationship, even just occasional updates about how we're both doing, I'd like that. I didn't commit to anything, but I also didn't rule it out entirely." The conversation had been more positive than I'd expected, but I wasn't ready to trust that the changes were permanent or that a relationship between us would be healthy. Over the following months, Emma and I exchanged occasional emails, brief updates about our lives, nothing dramatic or emotionally charged. She told me about getting promoted at work, about starting community college classes, about learning to live independently for the first time in her life. I shared news about medical school, about research projects I was working on, about the friends I was making in Portland. The correspondence felt tentative but genuine, like two people carefully testing whether a connection was possible. The real test came when my parents were released from prison and immediately began trying to contact both Emma and me. They sent letters, emails, messages through extended family members, all expressing their desire to heal the family and move forward together. Emma called me when the pressure became overwhelming. "They're saying the same things they always said," she told me. "That families stick together, that we should forgive and forget, that what's past is past. But they're not acknowledging what they did or showing any understanding of why we might not want contact with them. Are you considering seeing them?" "No, absolutely not. The work I've done in therapy has helped me understand how toxic that dynamic was, not just for you, but for me too. They trained me to believe that love meant manipulation, that family meant obligation without boundaries." This conversation solidified something for me. Emma wasn't just apologizing to me. She was actively choosing to reject the family patterns that had created the situation in the first place. She was prioritizing accountability over reconciliation, health over convenience. "I think I'd like to try meeting in person again," I told her. "Maybe without Marcus this time. Just the two of us." We met at a park in Iowa City, neutral territory for both of us. It was October, and the leaves were changing colors, creating a backdrop that felt appropriate for transformation and new beginnings. "I've been thinking about what kind of relationship we might be able to have," I said as we walked along the river. "I don't think we can ever go back to being the sisters we were before, but maybe we can figure out how to be something new." Emma nodded. "I'd like that. I know I have to earn your trust, and I know that might take years, but I'm willing to do the work if you're willing to let me try." We established some ground rules. No contact with our parents without discussing it first. Honest communication about our feelings, even when it was uncomfortable. Regular check-ins with our respective therapists about how the relationship was affecting our individual healing. It wasn't a fairy tale reconciliation. There were still moments when I caught glimpses of Emma's old manipulative tendencies, and times when my own protective instincts made me withdraw from connection. But slowly, carefully, we began building something that felt healthier than what we'd had before. Emma started volunteering with an organization that helped families navigate medical decisions, using her experience to identify potential red flags and manipulation tactics. She spoke at conferences about medical fraud, sharing her story as a cautionary tale about family dynamics and healthcare decisions. I began incorporating family systems therapy into my medical education, researching the ways that family manipulation could influence patient care and medical decision-making. My experience had given me insights that could help other healthcare providers recognize when families were pressuring patients into unwanted treatments. We were both finding ways to transform our trauma into purpose, to use what we'd learned from our family's dysfunction to help others avoid similar situations. The relationship we built wasn't the sisterhood I'd imagined as a child, but it was honest in a way our previous dynamic had never been. We talked about difficult topics without Emma expecting me to manage her emotions. We disagreed sometimes without her assuming I would eventually give in to her perspective. Most importantly, we both understood that our relationship was voluntary, not obligated. We chose to maintain contact because we found value in it, not because we were bound by genetics or family expectations. My parents continued their attempts to contact us for several months before finally accepting that neither Emma nor I was interested in reconciliation. The restraining order prevented them from approaching me directly, and Emma made it clear that any contact from them would result in her cutting off communication entirely. It was strange, being orphaned by choice rather than circumstance, but the freedom to build my life without their influence felt more valuable than maintaining relationships that had been fundamentally dishonest from the beginning. By my second year of medical school, I'd developed a specialty interest in medical ethics and patient advocacy. My professors knew about my background, and several encouraged me to consider research focused on family manipulation in healthcare settings. "Your experience gives you insights that could be incredibly valuable," Dr. Martinez, my ethics professor, told me during a mentoring session. "Most medical professionals are trained to work with families, not to recognize when families might be working against the patient's best interests." I began working on a research project examining cases where family members had pressured patients into unwanted medical procedures. The preliminary data was shocking. Financial motivation, inheritance disputes, insurance fraud, and emotional manipulation were more common factors in medical decision-making than most healthcare providers realized. Emma became one of my research collaborators, helping me understand the psychology of family manipulation from the perspective of someone who'd participated in it. Her insights were invaluable in developing screening tools that could help medical professionals identify potentially coercive family dynamics. "I never want another family to go through what we went through," she told me during one of our research sessions. "But I also never want another person to participate in harming someone they love the way I did." Working together on something meaningful helped solidify our new relationship. We weren't just sisters trying to rebuild trust. We were colleagues working toward a shared goal of protecting other families from the kind of dysfunction we'd experienced. The project eventually became the foundation for my medical school thesis and led to several published papers on family manipulation in healthcare settings. Emma co-authored some of the research, and we began speaking at medical conferences together about the importance of recognizing coercive family dynamics. It felt powerful, transforming our trauma into education that could help others. Instead of being victims of our family's dysfunction, we'd become experts in recognizing and preventing similar situations. The personal cost had been enormous. I'd lost a kidney, both of us had lost our parents, and our relationship had been fundamentally altered by betrayal and manipulation. But the professional and personal growth that emerged from that experience had shaped us into people who could help others avoid similar harm. 3 years after Emma's release from prison, we met for coffee on the anniversary of our first post-prison conversation. She looked healthy and confident, settled in her work and her new life in a way that seemed genuine and sustainable. "Do you ever regret meeting with me that first time?" she asked. I thought about the question seriously. The decision to rebuild a relationship with Emma had been risky, and there had been moments when I'd wondered if I was repeating old patterns of putting her needs before my own safety. "No," I said finally. "But I think that's because we both did the work to become different people. If you'd still been the person you were before prison, or if I'd still been the person who couldn't set boundaries, this wouldn't have worked." Emma nodded. "I think about the people we used to be sometimes, and I barely recognize them. It's like watching a movie of someone else's life." "Do you miss any of it? The family dynamics? The sense of belonging somewhere?" "I miss the illusion of it. I miss believing that I was unconditionally loved and that family meant safety. But I don't miss the reality of it, the manipulation, the guilt, the way we all used each other instead of actually caring for each other." I understood what she meant. Sometimes I felt nostalgic for the simplicity of believing my parents loved me without conditions, that Emma needed my protection, that family loyalty was automatically good and healthy. But I didn't miss the weight of constant obligation, the anxiety of never knowing when the next crisis would require me to sacrifice my own goals, the way I'd been trained to ignore my own instincts in favor of family expectations. "What we have now is better," I said. "It's harder, but it's real." Emma smiled, and for the first time since we'd reconnected, it looked completely genuine. "It is real. And it's ours, not something that was imposed on us by other people's expectations." As I drove back to Portland that evening, I thought about the journey I'd taken from the naive 21-year-old who'd agreed to donate a kidney without asking enough questions to the medical student who was now researching family manipulation in healthcare settings. The physical scar from my surgery had faded until it was barely visible, but the emotional scars had transformed into wisdom, strength, and purpose. I'd learned to trust my instincts, to set boundaries, to prioritize my own well-being without feeling guilty about it. Most importantly, I'd learned that family relationships should be chosen, not endured. The people who deserved access to my life were the ones who earned that privilege through consistent respect, honesty, and genuine care for my well-being. Emma had earned her way back into my life through 2 years of consistent change, accountability, and respect for my boundaries. My parents had not and probably never would. That distinction felt important, not just for my own healing, but for the work I was doing to help other families recognize the difference between healthy connection and manipulative obligation. The road ahead looked different than I'd imagined when I was 21 and planning to donate a kidney to save my sister's life. But it was a road I'd chosen for myself, built on foundations of honesty, self-respect, and carefully chosen relationships. For the first time in my life, I was exactly where I belonged. 5 years after the surgery that changed everything, I was completing my medical residency at Oregon Health Sciences University when the phone call came that would test everything I thought I'd resolved about my family. It was Dr. Patricia Coleman from Cedar Rapids General Hospital, the same hospital where I'd had my kidney removed. Her voice was professional but carried an undertone of urgency that immediately put me on alert. "Dr. Martinez, I'm calling because your mother, Linda Martinez, was brought into our emergency department this morning. She's listed you as her emergency contact." I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. My mother, who I hadn't spoken to in over 4 years, who was still legally prohibited from contacting me directly, had somehow managed to list me as her emergency contact despite the restraining order. "I'm sorry, but there must be some mistake. I'm not her emergency contact, and I haven't had any relationship with her since 2019. Dr. Coleman's pause was telling. "I see. Well, regardless of the family situation, I'm obligated to inform you that she's in critical condition. She suffered a massive stroke this morning and is currently on life support." The words hit me, like a physical blow, even though I'd spent years preparing myself emotionally for the possibility that my parents might face serious health issues without me being involved. The rational part of my brain understood that their choices had consequences, that I wasn't responsible for their well-being after what they'd done. But hearing that my mother was dying activated something deeper than rational thought. Something that felt like grief mixed with confusion and a terrible sense of unfinished business. What's her prognosis? The damage is extensive. We're running more tests, but initial scans show significant hemorrhaging in multiple areas of the brain. Even if she survives, there would likely be permanent cognitive and physical impairment. I found myself sitting down heavily in the hospital break room where I'd taken the call. Around me, other residents continued their normal routines, discussing cases and grabbing coffee, completely unaware that my world had just shifted again. "Is there other family there?" "Your father is here, and we've also contacted someone named Emma Martinez, who I believe is your sister." Of course Emma would be there. Despite everything we'd rebuilt between us, she'd maintained more flexibility about contact with our parents than I had. Not regular contact, but she'd never completely cut them off the way I had. "Dr. Martinez, I need to ask about advance directives and end-of-life decisions. As the listed emergency contact, you'd typically be involved in those conversations, but given what you've told me about your relationship..." "I can't make those decisions," I said quickly. "My father is her husband. Any medical decisions should go through him." "I understand. However, there's another complication. Your father is showing signs of severe dementia. He's been asking for someone named Linda for the past hour, not recognizing that she's the patient he's visiting. We're not sure he's competent to make medical decisions on her behalf." The situation was becoming surreal. My mother was dying, my father was losing his mental faculties, and somehow I was being pulled back into their orbit despite years of careful distance and legal protections. "Is Emma there now?" "She arrived about an hour ago. She's been asking if we'd contacted you." I closed my eyes and tried to think clearly. This wasn't about forgiveness or reconciliation. This was about two human beings facing medical crises, regardless of our complicated history. My medical training told me that someone needed to make informed decisions about my mother's care, and my father wasn't capable of doing so. "I'll drive down tonight," I heard myself saying. "But I want to be clear that I'm coming as a medical professional to help navigate healthcare decisions, not as a daughter seeking reconciliation." Dr. Coleman's relief was audible. "I understand completely. We'll see you when you arrive." The drive from Portland to Cedar Rapids took 6 hours, giving me plenty of time to process what I was walking into. I called Emma from the road, and she answered on the first ring. "Cassie, thank God you're coming. This is all so overwhelming, and Dad—" Her voice broke. "Dad doesn't even remember who I am half the time." "How long has he been showing signs of dementia?" "I don't know. I only saw them maybe 3 times a year, and he seemed okay at Christmas. Just a little forgetful." "But Emma, it's bad. He's confused about where he is. Keeps asking when Mom is coming home from the grocery store." I felt a complicated mix of emotions hearing the pain in Emma's voice. She'd maintained some connection with our parents, which meant she was experiencing their decline as a loss rather than just a medical situation to manage. "What have the doctors told you about Mom's condition?" "They're saying the stroke was massive. There's brain swelling, bleeding, and even if she survives, she'd need round-the-clock care for the rest of her life." I thought about my mother, as I'd last seen her during the trial, sitting in the defendant's chair wearing an orange jumpsuit, her face a mask of controlled emotion as she pled guilty to healthcare fraud. That woman had seemed strong, manipulative, capable of orchestrating complex deceptions. The idea of her lying helpless in a hospital bed felt impossible to reconcile. "Emma, I need you to understand something before I get there. I'm coming to help navigate the medical decisions because someone has to, but this doesn't change anything about our family dynamics. I'm not suddenly ready to forgive them or pretend the past didn't happen." "I know. I'm not expecting that. I just need help figuring out what to do." When I arrived at the hospital, Emma was waiting in the family consultation room looking exhausted and overwhelmed. She'd aged in the month since I'd last seen her, and the stress of the situation was written across her face. "Thank you for coming," she said when I walked in. "I know this is complicated for you." "Where's Dad now?" "Sleeping in Mom's room. The nurses said he gets agitated when he can't see her, even though he doesn't really understand what's happening." Emma led me through the hospital corridors, and I was struck by how familiar everything looked despite the years that had passed. The same color scheme, the same antiseptic smell, the same layout that I'd navigated as a patient rather than a visitor. My mother's room was in the ICU, filled with the quiet beeping of monitors and the rhythmic sound of a ventilator. She looked smaller than I remembered, pale and fragile in the hospital bed with tubes and wires connecting her to various machines. My father sat in a chair beside her bed, holding her hand and speaking to her in a soft voice. He looked up when we entered, and I was shocked by how much he'd changed. He was thinner, his hair completely gray now, and his eyes had the unfocused quality I'd learned to recognize in patients with cognitive decline. "Emma, sweetheart," he said when he saw us. "Have you seen your mother? She went to the store hours ago, and she's not back yet." Emma's face crumpled, and I felt my clinical training take over. I approached my father the way I would any confused patient, speaking calmly and clearly. "Dad, it's Cassandra. I'm here to help." He looked at me blankly for a moment, then his face lit up with recognition. "Cassie, you came home. Your mother will be so happy to see you when she gets back from the store." The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. This confused, vulnerable man was the same person who'd orchestrated medical fraud, who'd been willing to risk my life for financial gain. But dementia had stripped away his capacity for manipulation, leaving behind someone who seemed genuinely happy to see me. I spent the next hour talking with Dr. Coleman and the other specialists involved in my mother's care. The medical picture was grim. Extensive brain damage, multiple organ systems beginning to fail, and virtually no chance of meaningful recovery. With aggressive intervention, we might be able to keep her alive for weeks or months, Dr. Coleman explained. But she'd require a ventilator, feeding tube, dialysis, and round-the-clock care. There's no indication she'd ever regain consciousness or cognitive function. And without aggressive intervention, we'd focus on comfort care, pain management, and allowing her to die naturally. Based on the extent of the damage, that would likely happen within the next day or two. Emma and I sat with this information while my father dozed in the corner, still holding my mother's hand. The decision felt enormous, the kind of choice that would define how I remembered this moment for the rest of my life. "What do you think she would have wanted?" Emma asked quietly. I thought about my mother's personality, her fierce independence, her need to control every aspect of her environment. The idea of her existing in a vegetative state, completely dependent on others, seemed like a fate worse than death for someone who'd built her identity around being the matriarch of our family. "She would have hated being helpless," I said finally. "She would have hated being a burden, hated having people see her that way." Emma nodded. "I think so too, but making that decision feels impossible." I understood her conflict. Despite everything our parents had done, they were still the people who'd raised us, who'd been present for every childhood milestone, who'd shaped our understanding of what family meant. Making end-of-life decisions for them felt like a responsibility we'd never imagined having to bear. "Emma, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Are you hoping that if we make these medical decisions, it might lead to some kind of reconciliation or healing with them?" She was quiet for a long moment. Yes. Part of me keeps thinking that maybe if I handle this right, it could somehow make up for all the years of estrangement. That's not how it works. Making medical decisions for someone doesn't erase the harm they caused or create emotional closure. It's just a practical responsibility that someone has to handle. I know that logically, but emotionally. Emotionally, you're still their daughter, and that's okay. You don't have to stop loving them or stop wanting their approval just because they hurt us. We talked through the night, consulting with specialists, reviewing my mother's directives, and trying to understand what decision would be most aligned with her values and wishes. My father drifted in and out of lucidity, sometimes recognizing us, and sometimes asking when Linda would be coming home. As the sun began to rise, we made the decision to transition my mother to comfort care. It felt right, both medically and ethically, but it also felt like a final closing of a door that had been slowly swinging shut for years. "I want to sit with her," Emma said when the decision was finalized. "Are you sure? It might be difficult." I need to say goodbye. Even if she can't hear me." I understood. Despite everything, Emma had maintained hope for some kind of family healing. Sitting with our mother as she died was her way of honoring that relationship, even though it hadn't been what she'd hoped it could be. "I'll stay too," I said, surprising. "Myself. Not for her, but for you. And for Dad." The next 18 hours were unlike anything I'd experienced, even with my medical training. Watching someone die is always profound, but watching a parent die while navigating complicated feelings of grief, anger, relief, and sadness created an emotional complexity I hadn't been prepared for. My father seemed to understand on some level that something significant was happening. He held my mother's hand constantly, spoke to her in gentle tones, and occasionally sang songs I remembered from my childhood. The dementia had stripped away his capacity for manipulation, leaving behind what might have been his genuine feelings for her. Emma sat on the other side of the bed, talking to our mother about forgiveness, about love, about her hopes that somehow our family could have been different. I found myself listening to these one-sided conversations and feeling grateful that Emma had maintained enough connection to say these things, even though I couldn't. My own feelings were more complicated. I felt sad for the mother I'd wished I'd had, the woman who might have protected and supported me instead of viewing me as a resource to be exploited. I felt angry about the years of manipulation and the surgery that had been performed under false pretenses. But I also felt a strange sense of closure, as if watching her die was allowing me to finally put our relationship to rest. When she finally stopped breathing, just after midnight on the second day, the room fell into a profound quiet. The monitors stopped beeping, the ventilator was turned off, and for the first time in days, the only sound was my father's gentle weeping. "She's gone," he said, and his voice was clearer than it had been since I'd arrived. "My Linda is gone." Emma sobbed openly, grieving not just our mother's death but the relationship they'd never been able to repair. I felt tears on my face, too, though I wasn't entirely sure what I was crying for. The funeral arrangements fell to Emma and me, since my father's dementia made him incapable of handling the logistics. We kept the service small, just immediate family, and a few close friends who'd remained in contact with our parents over the years. Standing at the graveside, listening to the minister talk about my mother's life, I felt disconnected from the narrative being presented. He spoke about her devotion to family, her strength in the face of adversity, her love for her daughters. None of it was technically false, but it missed the complexity of who she'd actually been. After the service, several family friends approached me with condolences and comments about how proud my mother had always been of my medical career. It was surreal, hearing people talk about her maternal pride while knowing that she'd been willing to risk my life for financial gain. "She talked about you constantly," one of her book club friends told me. "She was so proud that you became a doctor, especially after everything the family went through." I smiled and thanked her, not having the energy to explain that my mother's pride had been complicated by guilt and the knowledge that she'd almost prevented me from having any career at all. The question of what to do about my father came up immediately after the funeral. His dementia was advancing rapidly, and he couldn't live independently. Emma and I found ourselves having conversations I'd never imagined we'd need to have. "I can't take care of him," Emma said during one of our discussions. "I don't have the resources or the knowledge, and honestly, I don't think I'm emotionally equipped for it." "Neither am I," I replied. "And I don't think he should be cared for. By family members anyway, given our history." We researched memory care facilities in the Cedar Rapids area, ultimately selecting one that specialized in dementia care and had a good reputation for treating patients with dignity and compassion. It felt strange making these decisions for someone who'd never shown similar concern for my well-being, but it also felt like the right thing to do. The day we moved my father into the facility, he seemed confused, but not distressed. He asked about Linda several times, and the staff was trained to redirect these conversations gently rather than repeatedly explaining that she'd died. "Will you visit him?" Emma asked as we were leaving. "I don't know. Maybe occasionally, but not regularly. I think it would be confusing for him and difficult for me." "I understand. I think I'll visit sometimes, at least until he doesn't recognize me anymore." Driving back to Portland after that week in Iowa, I felt a sense of completion that I hadn't expected. My mother was dead, my father was receiving appropriate care, and the practical responsibilities of their medical crises had been handled. But more than that, I discovered that I could navigate family emergencies without losing myself in the process. I'd maintained my boundaries while still acting compassionately. I'd made medical decisions based on ethics and the patient's best interests, rather than on guilt or obligation. I'd supported Emma through a difficult time without taking responsibility for her emotions. Most importantly, I'd proven to myself that my family's crises didn't have to become my crises. I could help when help was needed without sacrificing my own well-being or compromising the life I'd built. The experience had been painful, complicated, and emotionally exhausting, but it had also been empowering in an unexpected way. I'd faced the ultimate test of my ability to maintain healthy boundaries with my family, and I'd passed. When I returned to my residency, I threw myself back into my work with renewed focus. The experience of navigating my mother's end-of-life care had reinforced my interest in medical ethics and patient advocacy. I began developing protocols for recognizing family manipulation in healthcare settings, drawing on both my professional training and my personal experience. Emma and I continued our occasional correspondence, but the shared experience of our mother's death had brought us closer in some ways. We'd faced a family crisis together and handled it responsibly, proving that we could support each other without falling back into dysfunctional patterns. My mother's death had closed a chapter of my life that I'd thought was already finished. But facing her mortality, making decisions about her care, and watching her die had provided a different kind of closure than I'd expected. Not reconciliation or forgiveness, but a final recognition that she'd been a complex person capable of both love and harm, and that I could acknowledge both realities without being destroyed by either. The woman who'd orchestrated my medical manipulation was gone. The mother who'd sung lullabies and bandaged scraped knees was gone too. What remained was my own life, built on foundations of honesty, self-respect, and carefully chosen relationships. I was finally completely free. 7 years had passed since I first woke up in a hospital bed missing a kidney I should never have given. I was now Dr. Cassandra Martinez, attending physician at Portland General Hospital, specializing in internal medicine with a focus on medical ethics and patient advocacy. The work I'd built around preventing family manipulation in healthcare settings had gained national recognition. I'd published extensively on the subject, spoken at medical conferences across the country, and developed screening protocols that were being implemented in hospitals nationwide. But it wasn't until I received an email from a young woman named Jennifer Walsh that I realized how far the ripple effects of my experience had spread. "Dr. Martinez," her message began, "I heard you speak at the University of Michigan last month about family manipulation in medical settings. I think my family is trying to pressure me into donating bone marrow to my brother, and I don't know what to do." Jennifer was 23, a graduate student in engineering, and the youngest of 4 children. Her older brother had been diagnosed with leukemia, and while he was responding well to chemotherapy, their parents were insisting that she undergo testing to be a bone marrow donor just in case. The situation had red flags that I'd learned to recognize immediately. The parents were pressuring her to get tested before the medical team had determined if a transplant would even be necessary. They were framing her hesitation as selfishness and family disloyalty. Most concerning, they were threatening to cut off financial support for her education if she refused. I scheduled a video consultation with Jennifer, and within the first few minutes of our conversation, I could see myself at 21 in her uncertain expression and desperate desire to do the right thing. "They keep saying that family comes first," she told me, "that if I really loved my brother, I wouldn't need to think about it. But something feels wrong about the whole situation. Tell me about your relationship with your brother before he got sick." Jennifer's face changed. "We were never close. He was always the golden child, the one who could do no wrong. When I got accepted to graduate school, my parents barely acknowledged it, but when he got promoted at his sales job, they threw him a party." The pattern was heartbreakingly familiar. A family dynamic built around one favored child, with other children, existing primarily to serve that person's needs. Jennifer's parents weren't asking her to donate bone marrow out of love. They were demanding it as her expected role in the family hierarchy. "Have you spoken directly with your brother's medical team?" "No, my parents handle all the medical communications. They say it's too complicated for me to understand." This was another red flag. In legitimate medical situations, patients and potential donors had direct access to healthcare providers. When families controlled all medical information, it usually meant they were filtering or manipulating what the potential donor heard. "Jennifer, I want you to contact your brother's oncologist directly. Ask for a consultation about the necessity and timeline for bone marrow donation. Don't go through your parents, and don't accept their interpretation of what the doctors are saying. Over the following weeks, I stayed in contact with Jennifer as she navigated the medical system independently. What she discovered was exactly what I'd suspected. Her brother's treatment was progressing well. Bone marrow transplant was a distant possibility at best, and even if it became necessary, there were several compatible donors in the national registry. The urgency her parents had created was completely artificial. They'd been pressuring her to undergo testing and commit to donation for a medical scenario that might never occur, using emotional manipulation tactics that were textbook examples of family coercion. I confronted them with the information I got from the oncologist, Jennifer told me during our final consultation. They were furious that I'd gone behind their backs, said I was being disrespectful and selfish. How did that feel? Liberating, actually. For the first time in my life, I had information that wasn't filtered through their perspective. I could see how they'd been manipulating the situation. Jennifer's case reminded me why the work I was doing mattered. Families like ours weren't anomalies. They were part of a larger pattern of medical manipulation that happened more frequently than most healthcare providers realized. The screening protocols I'd developed had helped identify dozens of similar cases over the past few years. Patients being pressured into unnecessary surgeries, family members coerced into donating organs or tissue, elderly relatives manipulated into refusing treatment that would benefit them financially. Each case reinforced my belief that medical decisions should be made by informed patients in consultation with healthcare providers, not dictated by family dynamics or financial pressures. Emma had become one of my most effective collaborators in this work. Her perspective as someone who'd participated in medical manipulation brought insights that complemented my experience as a victim. Together, we'd developed educational materials for families facing legitimate medical crises, helping them navigate difficult decisions without resorting to coercion or manipulation. I think what we're really doing, Emma said during one of our quarterly planning meetings, is teaching people that love doesn't require sacrifice of autonomy. She was right. So much of family manipulation was disguised as love, devotion, or loyalty. Parents claimed they were protecting their children's best interests. Siblings insisted they were asking for help out of desperation rather than entitlement. But real love, we'd learned, respected boundaries. It honored individual autonomy. It didn't demand that people harm themselves to prove their devotion. The anniversary of my surgery came every December, and I'd developed a tradition of spending that day reflecting on how far I'd come. This year, I drove to the Oregon coast and walked along the beach, thinking about the journey from victim to advocate to healer. The physical scar from my surgery had completely faded, visible only if you knew exactly where to look. My remaining kidney functioned perfectly, and I'd suffered no long-term health consequences from the donation. In some ways, I'd been lucky. The medical fraud had been caught before it could cause permanent damage, but the emotional transformation had been profound. The naive young woman who'd agreed to surgery without asking enough questions had been replaced by someone who questioned authority, trusted her instincts, and prioritized her own well-being without guilt. I'd learned that setting boundaries wasn't selfish, it was essential. That questioning family narratives wasn't disloyal, it was wise. That choosing your own path, even when it disappointed people you loved, wasn't cruelty, it was courage. The work I was doing now felt like the culmination of everything I'd learned from that experience. Every patient I helped recognize family manipulation. Every medical professional I trained to identify coercive dynamics. Every family I educated about healthy decision-making represented a small victory against the kind of harm I'd experienced. My phone buzzed with a text from Emma. Saw the article about your research grant in the medical journal. So proud of everything you've built. The grant she was referring to would fund a 3-year study examining family manipulation in medical settings across 10 major hospital systems. It represented the largest research project ever undertaken on this topic, and the findings would likely influence medical ethics guidelines for years to come. I typed back, "Couldn't have done it without your partnership. Thank you for being brave enough to change." The relationship Emma and I had built wasn't the sisterhood we'd had as children, but it was healthier, more honest, and more supportive than anything we'd shared before. We were both different people than we'd been during the fraud, shaped by consequences and therapy, and the hard work of rebuilding trust. Sometimes I wondered what would have happened if the medical records hadn't been discovered, if I'd never learned about the deception. Would I have spent my life feeling grateful to have saved Emma's life? Would I have remained trapped in family dynamics that prioritized her needs over my well-being? The thought was chilling. I might have become a doctor still, but I would have been one who trusted families implicitly, who never questioned the narratives presented by loved ones, who couldn't recognize manipulation when it was disguised as love. Instead, I'd become someone who could help other people avoid the trap I'd fallen into. The betrayal that had nearly destroyed me had ultimately equipped me to protect others from similar harm. As I walked back to my car, I thought about Jennifer and the dozens of other people who'd reached out over the years, seeking help navigating family pressure around medical decisions. Each of their stories reinforced my belief that knowledge was the best protection against manipulation. When people understood their rights as patients, when they had access to unfiltered medical information, when they knew they could make decisions based on their own values rather than family expectations, they were much less likely to be coerced into unwanted procedures. The drive back to Portland took me through small towns and farmland that reminded me of Iowa, of the life I'd left behind when I chose my own path over family loyalty. I felt no nostalgia for that world, no regret for the relationships I'd lost, when I refused to continue enabling dysfunction. My father had died 6 months earlier, his dementia having progressed to the point where he no longer recognized anyone. Emma had been with him at the end, holding his hand as he passed peacefully, in his sleep. I'd chosen not to attend the funeral, a decision that felt right for me, even though it disappointed some extended family members. You don't owe anyone your presence at events that would be harmful to your well-being, my therapist had reminded me when I was struggling with the decision. Grief and closure look different for everyone. She was right. My closure with my father had come years earlier, when I'd finally accepted that the man who'd raised me and the man who'd orchestrated medical fraud were the same person. I didn't need to stand at his graveside to acknowledge his death or process my complicated feelings about our relationship. Back in Portland, I returned to my apartment and opened my laptop to review the applications for the new fellowship program I was developing. The fellowship would train medical professionals to recognize and address family manipulation in healthcare settings, creating a new generation of providers equipped to protect vulnerable patients. One application stood out immediately. It was from Dr. Maria Santos, a young emergency physician who'd written about her own experience discovering that her grandmother's family had been pressuring her to refuse dialysis so they could inherit her house more quickly. I became a doctor to help people, Dr. Santos had written, but I never realized how often the people who need help are being harmed by their own families. I want to learn how to identify these situations and advocate for patients who can't advocate for themselves. I marked her application as a priority candidate and made a note to schedule an interview. Experiences like hers were exactly what the fellowship program needed. Healthcare providers who understood both the medical and emotional complexities of family manipulation. My phone rang as I was finishing my review. It was Dr. Patricia Coleman, the physician who'd called me years earlier about my mother's stroke. "Cassandra, I hope you don't mind me calling. I wanted to let you know about a case we just handled here at Cedar Rapids General." She went on to describe a situation involving an elderly man whose children had been pressuring him to undergo unnecessary cardiac surgery so they could claim he was too sick to manage his own finances. The medical team had used the screening protocols I'd developed to identify the coercive family dynamics and had ultimately protected the patient from an unwanted procedure. "Your work literally saved this man from surgical risk he didn't need to take," Dr. Coleman said. "I thought you should know the impact you're having." After I hung up, I sat in my living room and felt a profound sense of satisfaction. The trauma I'd experienced had been transformed into tools that were protecting other people from similar harm. The betrayal that had nearly destroyed my family had become the foundation for work that was strengthening other families. I thought about the young woman I'd been 7 years earlier, driving home from Northwestern to hear about Emma's supposed illness. That version of myself had been so eager to help, so trusting of family narratives, so unprepared for the possibility that love could be weaponized. I wouldn't want to go back to being that person, even if it meant avoiding all the pain that followed. The knowledge I'd gained, the strength I'd developed, the work I was able to do now, all of it had emerged from that experience of being completely betrayed by the people I'd trusted most. The scars from betrayal, I'd learned, could become sources of wisdom. The experience of being manipulated could teach you to recognize manipulation in others. The pain of family dysfunction could motivate you to help other families function more healthily. Sometimes the best revenge wasn't getting back at the people who hurt you. Sometimes it was becoming the person who could prevent that same hurt from happening to others. I opened my laptop again and began drafting an email to Jennifer Walsh, checking in on how she was doing and offering continued support as she navigated her family dynamics. Her brother's treatment was progressing well, no bone marrow transplant had been necessary, and she'd maintained her boundaries despite ongoing pressure from her parents. "I wanted to thank you again," her most recent email had said, "for helping me understand that protecting myself wasn't the same as abandoning my family. I'm learning to love them without sacrificing myself for them." That distinction, I thought, was the most important lesson anyone could learn about family relationships. Love without sacrifice of autonomy. Support without loss of self. Connection without coercion. As I typed my response to Jennifer, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought me to this point. 7 years ago, I'd been a victim of medical fraud, betrayed by my own family, facing the collapse of everything I'd believed about love and loyalty. Now I was a doctor, an advocate, a researcher, and a teacher. I was someone who could help other people avoid the trap I'd fallen into, who could turn my trauma into tools for healing and protection. The kidney I'd lost had been replaced by something more valuable. The knowledge to help others keep what was theirs, the wisdom to recognize manipulation disguised as love, and the strength to choose my own path even when it disappointed people I cared about. I had everything I needed to build the life I wanted, surrounded by people who respected my boundaries and supported my goals. The family I'd been born into had shaped me, but the family I'd chosen to be part of now was built on foundations of honesty, mutual respect, and genuine care. Sometimes the best outcome isn't getting back what you lost. Sometimes it's discovering that what you gain is more valuable than what you'll ever miss. I was Dr. Cassandra Martinez, and I was exactly who I was meant to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.